outside of Westchester Medical Center in Valhalla, New York. On March 23rd, 2003, a woman is witnessed stabbing a man inside of a vehicle in the middle of broad daylight. Luckily, a group of bystanders intervenes and the man is able to escape, surviving the attack as well as the emergency surgery that followed. Before he goes under, he tells police that the attacker was his wife. The case seemed open and shut. However, police would come to learn that this was not her first attempt on someone's life, rather just her first failed attempt. The investigation would unearth a shocking string of deceit, manipulation, lust, and violence. This is the Sheila Davalloo story. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime cases each week. If you have an interest in true crime like me and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Sheila Davalloo was born on May 11th, 1969. A majority of her early life was spent living in Iran, and because of this, Sheila had a very stressful childhood. Growing up in such a volatile climate really took a toll on her early in life. Due to the increasing violence, her family fled Iran in the late 1970s to escape the Iranian Revolution. They moved to the United States and settled in Yorktown Heights, New York. Sheila's parents were both very driven and very accomplished in the medical and public health fields, and because of their success, education was very important to her parents. Naturally, Sheila was an incredible student. She is almost always referred to as a highly intelligent person. She excelled in high school before moving on to college to study at the State University of New York, where she earned a degree in biochemistry before moving on to secure her master's from New York Medical College. While working on her master's degree, Sheila met and began a relationship with a man named Paul Christos. She was drawn to his intelligence and his good looks, and the two got serious about one another pretty quickly. The only problem was that Sheila had a whole-ass husband that Paul knew nothing about. She was married to a man named Farid Musavi. And Paul and Sheila actually dated for over a year before he found out the truth. But if you think he found out because Sheila decided to be honest, then sadly, you're mistaken. Paul only found out about Farid because Farid found out about Paul. In 1995, Farid called Paul to let him know that, he existed. And after speaking on the phone to one another briefly, the two men actually decided to meet up in order to finish their conversation. Farid told Paul that Sheila was chaotic and unpredictable and dramatic, and that because of this affair, he planned to end their marriage. But once the marriage ended, Sheila gave Paul a very different story, one where her marriage to Farid was actually arranged, and that it was never loving or happy, and that they'd actually already been separated when she began seeing Paul. And if Sheila is one thing for sure, it's a master of manipulation. She came across as very sincere and very apologetic, and Paul believed her. They got back together and their relationship flourished into a marriage in the year 2000. The following year, the couple settled in Pleasantville, New York. Sheila accepted a job as a research scientist at Purdue Pharma in Stamford, Connecticut, and Paul worked for Cornell University's New York campus. On the surface, their marriage appeared stable, but it was no longer the hot, spicy, exciting affair that it once was. It had grown comfortable, and the more comfortable Sheila got, the more bored Sheila got. She and Paul were working long hours, and as their careers progressed, they barely saw one another. Sheila began to feel as though she and Paul were roommates more so than they were lovers. It wasn't until right now that I realized how gross of a word lovers is. Anyways, her excitement returned during the summer of 2001 when Sheila met a man by the name of Nelson Sessler. Nelson also worked at Purdue Pharma, and the two officially met when they were assigned to the same research team. And despite the fact that they were colleagues, there was a pretty immediate spark between the two of them. Sheila thought Nelson was charismatic. He was funny and outgoing, and it didn't take long for her to act on these feelings, taking their relationship from business to pleasure. I like my word choices today. This was no sloppy workplace affair. It was calculated, and it had to be executed very precisely. Well, on Sheila's end at least, because Nelson wasn't even aware that he was involved in an affair. He had no idea that Sheila was even married. It's understandable that he had no clue, because not only would Sheila spend the night at his place, he'd spend the night at her place. And when I say her place, I do indeed mean the home that she shared with her husband, Paul. I assume you're wondering how the hell she managed to pull that one off, and I'm here to tell you that It was a production. Sheila told Paul that she had a mentally ill brother, which was true, but the next part certainly is not. She told Paul that if her brother ever found out that she was married, that he would totally freak out, and that he would need to stay with her from time to time, and that when he did, Paul had to leave, and that he was not to come back until her brother was gone. When in actuality, she was conning her husband into leaving the house so she could get it on with her boyfriend. Lock this in your noggin as a character representation of Sheila. She is very self-serving, and she will do anything that she has to get what she wants, no matter who she has to hurt, manipulate, or deceive along the way. Paul would later say that obviously he thought the arrangement was weird, but that he did it anyway because he was trying to be a loving and supporting husband. He would even go around the house and help Sheila collect any clothing, photos, or personal items that might tip off her brother that a man was living there. I guess they did a pretty damn good job of it, because it wasn't until police began investigating Sheila in 2003 that Nelson ever found out about Paul. And this was exactly how her plan was meant to work. Sheila was very careful to keep her two lives separate because she was obsessed with Nelson, and she was going to do anything she had to make sure that their relationship stayed on track. Unfortunately for Sheila, Nelson really wasn't on the same page as her, and he continued to date other people the whole time he was seeing her. Nothing got very serious until he began seeing another coworker of theirs, a woman by the name of Annalisa Raimondo. This relationship actually caused Nelson to break things off with Sheila because he wanted to pursue something more serious with Annalisa. And according to Nelson, Sheila took it like a champ. She referred to their relationship as a summer fling that had run its course. But Sheila was anything but fine with the end of their relationship, and she expressed her frustrations often to none other than her husband, Paul. She didn't come right out and say, like, oh honey, my boyfriend dumped me and that's why I'm in a bad mood tonight. Sheila instead took a much more complex route. She instead told her husband of a love triangle at work between a man named Jack, a woman named Melissa, and another woman named Annalisa. Yeah, she really fell apart with the creativity at the end there. But she would talk about this love triangle all the time to Paul. Can you believe what Jack is doing to Melissa? And what should Melissa do? And blah, blah, blah. Like, she was for real out here asking her husband for boyfriend advice. The disrespect. Meanwhile, while Nelson's relationship with Annalisa continued to blossom, so did Sheila's rage. The couple seemed to be moving forward, but Sheila was stuck in the past. By 2002, Annalisa and Nelson were engaged and living together in her Stanford apartment, and Sheila was still coasting through the same loveless relationship she'd been stuck in for years. She was extremely jealous of Annalisa because she had everything that she wanted, and Sheila refused to go down without a fight. Finally, on November 8th, 2002, her jealousy and rage became much too much for her to bear, and she decided that the only solution was to remove Annalisa from the equation entirely. She went into work that morning just as she always did, but that day in particular, she opted to take a very extended 3-hour lunch break. It's believed that after Sheila left work, she proceeded to Annalisa's apartment, where she forced her way inside, bludgeoned Annalisa with a dumbbell, and then proceeded to stab her to death. Once Sheila had fled the scene, but before returning to work, she made a very interesting choice. She stopped at a nearby payphone to call police and alert them of the attack.
Yes, hello. I think the guy is attacked my neighbor.
You think someone attacked your neighbor? What is your friend's name?
I don't know her name, but she's my neighbor and she lives in 105.
She lives in apartment 105?
Right. I'm in 106 Harbor View. 123 Harbor View.
126 Harbor View.
123 Harbor View.
Police responded immediately and proceeded to Annalisa's apartment, where they discovered a very grisly and gruesome murder scene. The apartment was in complete disarray, and because Annalisa had been stabbed 9 times, there was blood everywhere. Even the stairs and walkway leading out of the apartment were covered in blood. I mean, the scene was really awful. One of the detectives still refers to this case as the one, stating that everyone on the job has like one case or one scene that they will just never get over, and that this is the one for him. While the scene was being processed, Nelson actually returned home from work with absolutely no idea what had gone on there that day. He was stopped by police and brought up to speed, but He responded very, very calmly, and police found that odd, and frankly, they found it suspicious. They brought him in for questioning, but he was actually cleared within 24 hours because Purdue Pharma has a very extensive security system, so it was easy for them to verify Nelson's exact whereabouts throughout basically that entire day. Sadly, due to the 911 call, police exhausted a lot of effort looking for a plausible male suspect, as well as trying to track down the neighbor who had made the phone call, but they continuously came up empty-handed on both fronts. The only physical piece of evidence that police were able to recover from the scene was a small spot of blood they found on a bathroom faucet in Annalise's apartment. They believed the blood to have been left by the killer, but they weren't able to make anything come of the sample for quite some time. Little did police know that the person who made the 911 call was actually the person who had committed this awful crime. For a while, it appeared as though Sheila was going to get away with murder. Better yet, her plan worked. Nelson was devastated by Annalise's death, and Sheila made a point to be front and center, ready and waiting with open arms to comfort and console him through his hard time. And before long, their relationship kicked right back up from where it had left off. Sheila had Nelson back, and everything seemed to be going exactly as she'd planned. That is, until 2003, when Paul got fed up with their distant and practically non-existent relationship. He expressed his concerns to Sheila, and in response, she came up with an idea, a way to reconnect and kind of spice things up between the two of them. On March 23rd, 2003, Sheila made a suggestion to Paul that they play a game. One person would be blindfolded and handcuffed, and the other would touch them with various objects from around the home, and the blindfolded person would have to guess what they were touching them with. An erotic sensory game of sorts, which I'm also pretty sure, wasn't this like a YouTube thing like 7 years ago? Anyways, Sheila volunteered to be blindfolded first, and everything went according to plan. Paul touched Sheila with things like the television remote. After a few rounds, they switch places. Sheila blindfolds and handcuffs Paul. They play a few rounds, everything's fine. And then she sits across his lap and tells him that she has one more object for him to guess. It was at this point that Paul recalls feeling, quote, a thrust like a heavy weight on my chest, and then another thrust, unquote. Sheila immediately began frantically apologizing and saying, oh my God, you're hurt. I think I may have hurt you. You're bleeding. So she takes the blindfold off of Paul, and he looks down to see that his shirt is soaked with blood. He starts freaking out and telling Sheila that she needs to uncuff him immediately, but all of a sudden she can't find the key. After scrambling around to look for the key, Sheila claims that she then broke the chair, and once Paul had moved, that she was able to find it and uncuff him. At this point, Paul is begging Sheila to call 911, and she tells him that she has, but then 30 minutes passes and still no ambulance. And Paul, bleeding from a knife wound to the chest, is kind of like, hey girl, what's going on? Where's the ambulance? Sheila tells him that they're probably just busy and that he needs to be patient. Surprisingly, Paul's not really down to just kick it and hope they arrive before he bleeds out, so he begs Sheila to please just take him to the hospital. After stalling for even longer, Sheila then finally helps Paul into the car and heads in the direction of Westchester Medical Center. Not to the emergency room. No, Sheila drove right past that, didn't even slow down. Instead, she parked in the back, secluded area of the behavioral health building's parking lot. If she really was trying to save Paul's life, why would she drive past the emergency room to the far back end of a completely different building? It didn't make sense. Honestly, that fact pales in comparison to what happened next. Sheila then proceeded to the back of the car as if in an effort to help Paul out of the vehicle, but no. She then stabbed him again. Luckily for Paul, even with 3 knife wounds to the chest, he was able to fight her off and get a hold of the knife and throw it far away from his crazy-ass wife. Just across the parking lot, a group of people witnessed this whole thing play out, and they immediately rushed over to help Paul. In response to this, Sheila got in the car and drove off. Unbeknownst to Paul, the final stab wound to his chest had actually nicked his heart, and he was bleeding internally. One of the people in the group had called for help to get Paul into the hospital, as well as called the police. And while they waited for this help to arrive, Sheila actually busted a U-ey and came back and tried to force Paul to get back in her car. Luckily, everyone was kind of like, yeah, I don't think we're gonna let him go with you. Emergency medical help for Paul arrived almost simultaneously with police. Paul was rushed to the hospital for emergency open heart surgery, and Sheila was taken down to the police station for questioning. Once at the station, Sheila didn't really seem concerned with what was going on with Paul. Even when police told her that he was headed into open heart surgery and that he might not make it, her only real concern seemed to be who was going to go to her house and take care of her dog. I mean, I love my dog too, but if my husband's heart was exposed on an operating table, I'm pretty sure my dog would not be my first concern. Once police got Sheila to focus on the actual matter at hand, they asked her to explain what had happened that day, and she told police that she really didn't know because Paul had come home with the stab wounds. She said that she didn't even notice them at first and that she didn't notice them until Paul sprawled out on the floor and told her that he was hurt and he needed her to come look. She'd also mentioned that she'd been apprehensive to even look at his wounds because the sight of blood makes her nauseous. What Sheila was unaware of was that police had actually gotten a chance to speak to Paul before he had gone under for his surgery, so they challenged her with his version of events, letting her know that he had painted them a very different story of what had happened that day. Sheila then changed her tune real quick to, oh, we were playing this game and I nicked him with a knife and he was thrashing around in pain from that, and then I accidentally stabbed him and he continued to struggle, and then that must have been when the third knife wound happened. She told them that she had called 911, but no one had picked up, so she'd rushed Paul to the hospital herself. Sheila has never been able to explain the inconsistencies in her stories in a way that makes sense. She has always maintained that she doesn't remember her initial interrogation and that she has no idea why she lied. She defended her actions by saying that because it was such a small knife, it proved that there was no malicious intent, that if she had truly wanted to kill Paul, that she wouldn't have used a paring knife. I personally find this to point towards premeditation more than anything. I think she thought that a small knife would be easier to pass off as an accident than a butcher knife, a cleaver, an axe would have been. That's just my humble opinion though. Sheila has never made any statements that could actually validate that theory. Luckily, Paul managed to pull through the surgery and he was expected to make a full recovery. But despite that fact, Sheila was held on assault charges so that the investigation could continue. Police looked into Sheila's cell phone records and determined that she had never made any attempts to call 911. That instead, she had attempted to call a man named Nelson Sessler. Of course, police are now very curious to find out who Nelson is and why Sheila would call him instead of 911 while her husband lay dying in their home. So they reached out to Nelson and requested that he come into the station for an interview. He agreed to come in, and I bet he was hella confused about what was going on. He told police that he and Sheila had been in an on-again, off-again, Ross and Rachel-esque relationship for over a year at this point. Police are like, where does her husband fit into all that? And Nelson's like, nah, she's not married. And police are like, yeah, she is. That's why you're here. She tried to stab her husband. And poor Nelson's just like, what? Deer in the headlights. Nelson didn't even know Sheila was married, let alone that she was the kind of gal to try and whack her husband during a sex game in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. To say he was shocked would be a massive understatement. After receiving this information, Nelson became an open book. He told them how they met, how their relationship started, how it briefly ended when he'd gotten engaged to someone else, how they'd reconciled after his fiancée Annalisa had been brutally murdered in their Stanford apartment, how they'd been together ever since, and how the phone call that day was a dinner invitation. Police are like, why don't we circle back around to that murdered fiancé thing? Did Sheila try to murder her husband so that she could be with Nelson? And if so, is it at all possible that Sheila was involved in the murder of Nelson's fiance? Police weren't sure, but they knew it was a connection worth looking into. Seeing her relationship with Nelson as a motive to want Paul dead, they upgraded her charge from assault to assault, criminal possession of a weapon, and attempted murder. Her trial began on February 4th, 2004, and if convicted, she faced up to 25 years in prison. The prosecution argued that Sheila was manipulative and self-serving, that she could not handle the public humiliation of a second divorce, so she decided to murder Paul to end their marriage so she could continue her relationship with Nelson. Sheila's defense argued that at the time of the stabbing, she had suffered a dissociative episode, and that this episode had been brought on by PTSD from years of living in a volatile, war-torn country. That at the precise moment of the stabbing, Sheila was unaware of her actions. The problem with this defense was that it only came to be after Paul lived and was able to actually actually recount what had happened that day. The prosecution argued that there was plenty of evidence to dispute Sheila's claims, that if she had truly not wanted Paul to die, then why didn't she call 911? Why did she instead call and invite her boyfriend to dinner? Why did she continue to stall before taking him to the hospital? Why did she drive past the emergency room? Why did she then stab Paul a third time in the car? Her story did not make sense. And you know what else didn't make sense? Was Paul's testimony. He actually testified on Sheila's behalf. He said that he believed her, that she did not want to kill him, and that he still very much loved and cared for her and thought that more than anything, she needed help for her mental illness. Let me clarify that I think it's admirable that he stood by his wife, and I'm not criticizing him in any way. I'm just saying that if I'm imagining myself in his shoes, I don't think I could have done the same thing. Closing arguments for the trial took place on February 18th, after which the judge took a day to come to a decision, and on February 19th, 2004, Judge Dickerson found Sheila Davalloo guilty of attempted murder. He called her a dangerous threat to society before he handed down the maximum punishment allowed, which was 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. But our story is far from over. With Sheila behind bars and no longer an immediate threat to society, police were free to revive and put all of their energy into solving the Annalisa Raimundo case. Annalisa was just 32 years old at the time of her death. She and her parents had come to the United States from the Philippines so that her parents could pursue their medical careers. Annalisa was an incredibly intelligent and educated woman. She had graduated from Harvard before accepting a position in pharmaceutical research at Purdue Pharma. Despite their common workplace at the time of Annalisa's murder, there was no reason for police to even know who Sheila Davalloo was, let alone suspect her as their killer. All police had to link a killer to the crime scene was a tiny spot of blood that had been found on a faucet in the bathroom off of the foyer of Annalisa's apartment. Police assumed that the blood was left by the attacker in an attempt to clean themselves up enough to where they could exit the apartment in the middle of broad daylight and not draw too much attention to themselves. It was huge for the case that they had the killer's DNA, but initially they didn't have anyone to match it to, so it really didn't do them much good at first. The only other thing they had to work with was the 911 call from the morning of the attack. The 911 call made by a person claiming to be one of Annalisa's neighbors. However, when the call was traced, it didn't come back to the complex. It came back to a payphone about 3/4 of a mile away, which basically proved that it was not a neighbor that had made the phone call. Why would a neighbor leave the safety of their own home to walk almost a mile to a payphone to call 911 when they're concerned that a violent maniac just attacked their neighbor? If they were that concerned and that scared, they would have called from inside their own home. Like most of the things we've talked about today, it just didn't make sense. Literally, no one would do that. In the weeks following the murder, the police put a ton of effort into trying to identify the voice on that call. They asked everyone they spoke to if the voice sounded familiar or if maybe they could help them identify it, but no one ever could. Police literally had 2 pieces of evidence, and neither piece was helping them move the case forward at all. And because of this, it grew cold. Until following Sheila's arrest for Paul's stabbing, Westchester and Stanford authorities teamed up to determine if there was any possible way that these cases actually were related. When comparing notes and information for the 2 cases, Stanford investigators played the 911 tape for Westchester investigators, and immediately, and I mean immediately, they were like, yeah, we've got your girl. It's Sheila Davalloo. They recognized her voice like that. The next order of business was to attempt to determine Sheila's whereabouts the day of the murder. Much like they did for Nelson, they contacted Purdue Pharma and requested her access card information as well as any relevant video footage. While Nelson's workplace records helped to clear his name, Sheila's did the opposite. They incriminated her real bad. It was on record that Sheila had left work for 3 hours the day of the murder, and that the 3 hours she was gone exactly lined up with the time frame of the murder as well as the 911 call. Police now knew that Sheila not only had a motive, but she also had opportunity. But could they definitively place Sheila in the apartment? You bet your ass they could. Because after DNA comparison, the teeny tiny spot of blood that had been found on Annalisa's faucet came back as a perfect match to none other than Miss Sheila Davalloo. Rather than rush to trial, police took their time creating an ironclad case. Too much time, if you ask some people. They figured that Sheila wasn't going anywhere for 25 years, so why not go all out, you know? Finally, on December 29th, 2008, 6 years after Annalisa's murder, charges are brought against Sheila Davalloo. Police actually went to the prison and re-arrested Sheila, and she was like, "What? You're mistaken. I didn't kill anybody." You see, Sheila is a pathological liar and a master manipulator. She always thinks she's the smartest person in the room, and she always thinks that she can explain anything away. She was so confident in her ability that when her trial began on January 24th, 2012, Sheila decided to forego legal counsel and represent herself. Now, this is pretty commonly believed to be a really, really bad idea. That's why the saying literally goes, a lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client. But Sheila didn't care. She was sure that she could outsmart everyone in that courtroom. As the trial began, the prosecution argued that Sheila murdered Annalisa so that she could have Nelson all to herself. And Sheila argued that, nuh-uh. Surely she worded it more eloquently than that, but it's the gist. To solidify their case, the prosecution called Paul to the witness stand. Unfortunately for Sheila, he didn't have such glowing things to say about her this time around. He testified about Sheila and Nelson's affair, how she had manipulated him into vacating their home so she could spend time with Nelson, and most unfortunate for Sheila, he testified about the love triangle that Sheila often spoke of. How she always seemed to vehemently dislike Annalisa, and how she always posed Annalisa as the antagonist of the story. He also spoke of his own ordeal with Sheila, which helped to establish the fact that she was absolutely capable of the crime of which she was being accused. Once Paul finished testifying, they called Nelson to the witness stand. He testified about his affair with Sheila, how she'd hidden her marriage from him, and how he'd ended their relationship to pursue something more serious with Annalisa. The prosecution also secured a voice analysis expert who confirmed that Sheila was in fact the voice on the 911 call. As for the DNA evidence, Sheila argued that it should be thrown out because it had been contaminated. She argued that it had left the crime lab and been returned to the crime lab, therefore had not been properly preserved. Sheila had an over-the-top explanation for every shred of evidence that was brought against her and every lie she was caught in. Honestly, I feel like that made her look more guilty than anything. And the jury must have agreed because on February 10th, 2012, they found Sheila Davalloo guilty of the murder of Annalisa Raimundo. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison to run consecutively or in addition to her current 25-year sentence for an overall bid of 75 years in prison. She denies any involvement in the murder of Annalisa to this day, but does now seem to take some responsibility for her actions against Paul. However, she continues to deny any intentions of murdering him. And that about sums up the case of Sheila Davalloo. It's wild to think that if she had not tried to take out her husband, that she absolutely would have gotten away with murdering Annalisa. I hate to say, like, you know, thank God she stabbed Paul, but kinda. Sorry, Paul. I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and listen to this story. I think it's a pretty crazy one, so I'd be really interested in hearing your opinions. As always, if you have any case suggestions, feel free to leave those down below. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I put out new true crime content each week, and I would love to see you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.